much needed voice in controversy. Job 32, 1 to 22. Now, these are controversial times. There is medical controversy. Masks, no masks. Isolation or herd immunity. The WHO is right. No, Sweden is right. There's also political controversy. It's the Chinese virus. Or it's an American military conspiracy. There's a push by Australia to investigate the origins of the virus, and now China is banning Australian imports. There are local controversies as well, aren't there? Who's sovereign and who's not sovereign? Whether to da bao gui chap or to gong. To apologize to the foreign workers or not to apologize to them. And we also, during this time, have our personal controversies. In such a climate, people may have lost friends, loved ones. People may have lost their jobs. Recession may be coming. And in the midst of all of this, there are many voices, many perspectives, why it happened and what should have been done, when it should have been done, and how we can overcome it. So there has been controversy. And the current situation also reminds us of our own lives, that in our lives there are controversies, there are problems. People fight, children fight, parents fight, couples fight, and church members fight as well. Well, who is right? Who is wrong? We hear from this person and that person hears from another person, and it's often confusing. But as we go through such times, it's important to listen to the one voice that really matters, and that's the voice of Christ that speaks from the pages of Holy Scripture. We need his perspective, not only for current trials, but for trials in the future, controversies in the future. Now, Job here was going through great controversy with his friends. He had his perspective. They also had their perspective. And we ask the question, who was right? Who was wrong? Were they wrong in everything that they said? And if they were wrong, was Job right in everything that he said? Well, in fact, they were not all wrong in all that they said, and he was not right in all that he said. But in the midst of controversy, we learn from this passage that there was another voice, and it was a much needed voice in controversy. There was a fourth friend, and he was not mentioned at first. He came with the other three. He sat silently, and it's only revealed in chapter 32 that he was there. His name was Elihu. And in so many ways, he is the voice that all of us need to hear, not only in these times of controversies, but in every time when there is controversy. Now, there are three things to learn from this passage. Firstly, the need for a godly voice. The need for a godly voice. Secondly, the need for a zealous voice. And thirdly, the need for a wise voice. So firstly, the need for a godly voice. We're introduced in the beginning of the book of Job to Job himself, and the Bible calls him upright and a perfect man. But he suffered, and when he suffered, he despaired. His friends, they were believers, but when they heard his despair, when they heard him voicing his despair, they despised him. But here you have Elihu, a godly man with a godly heritage. Now, who was he? In verse 2, it says that he was the son of Barhel, the Buzite of the kindred of Ram. Now, such details should jump out at us. Now, not much is said about Job's parentage. nor that of his friends, but Elihu's parentage is spoken about. It is written. His father's name was Barachel. He was a Buzite, and they were of the family, of the lineage of Ram. And we see here from his name that it was a Hebrew name. Now, Job's friends, the Temanite, the Shuhite, the Naamathite, they were not Jewish. They were not Israelite. But Elihu was an Israelite name. He was a Hebrew. I should say not Israelite, but Hebrew. This took place before Jacob was born. And his name, Elihu, means, my God is he. His father's name was Barachel, which means blessing of God. And they were from the family of Buz. Now, who is Buz? Take a look at Genesis 22, 20 to 21. And we read here in Genesis 22, verse 20, and it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah, she hath also borne children unto thy brother Nahor, Huz, his firstborn, and Buz, his brother, and Kemuel, the father of Aram. So we learn from Genesis 22 that Abraham had two brothers. Haran had a son called Lot. Nahor had a son called Buz. So in other words, Elihu and Barachel, they were cousins of Abraham, several times removed. Buz had come from out of Ur together with Abraham, and specifically our text makes one detail very clear, that Elihu was of the kindred of Ram. Now, Abraham's original name, Abram, or in Hebrew, Avram, means my father or my forefather was Ram. So this detail here is important because it tells us that not only did Elihu's grandfather come out of Ur together with Abraham and Nahor and so forth, but all of this is written to tell us that Elihu had a godly heritage, that he was connected with Abraham's family. In other words, his family had left Ur, they renounced idolatry, they worshiped the true and living God. But of course, heritage doesn't mean a thing unless the children possess the faith of the fathers. And Elihu did. We see now his godly legacy. Elihu was likely the author of Job, and he likely entrusted it to Abraham. So this makes Job the oldest book of the Bible. Now, how do we know that it was Elihu who wrote it? Now, it's not very specific from the text, but it's not that it was mentioned, but the fact that it was not mentioned that gives us this clue that he was the author. Now, firstly, only two people are given any detailed introduction, Job and Elihu. Now, Job was introduced very extensively because this entire book is about him. Elihu was also introduced in a manner in which the other friends were not, because he is the author. And he was introduced to show his credibility. Now, there are more than 30 chapters of Job. None of his friends are given any significant introduction. Now, secondly, his appearance was also very brief, but very personal. And this gives us a clue. He only speaks in a few chapters. As mentioned before, for 30 chapters, all of his other friends and Job were arguing back and forth, but his appearance is for a short time, but it was also very personal. It gives insight into his character. And this is how authors in those days, in ancient days, introduced themselves without really saying who they were. We have this especially in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew, he was the only gospel writer who wrote about the banquet that he threw for Jesus, where he invited other tax collectors. This was a personal detail that was important to him. It was brief, it was personal. Now, similarly, in the Gospel of Mark, you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, after Jesus was arrested, there was also a young man in the garden that was arrested, but he ran away. He left behind his clothes. He ran away naked, probably in his loincloth, when his coat was grabbed, and there was no one else around. Now, how would Mark, the gospel writer, know this detail about this man who ran away naked and no one else was around? It's because that was the author. Mark was the author. Mark was the young man, and he was putting this detail in there. And furthermore, in the Gospel of John, at the end, Peter asked Jesus, now what would happen to that beloved disciple? Would he die? Would he not die? And Jesus told him to mind his own business. And we know that the beloved disciple, the one who leaned upon the bosom of Jesus, that was John the Apostle himself. So these are personal, private details that authors would use to identify themselves. So here, Job was likely written by Elihu. The detail of his name was personal. It shows his godly legacy. The fact that he probably wrote the book as well shows us that he was trusted to do that, and trusted by God. Now, we also learn that he had a godly commendation. And again, this is an argument from silence. We know that he was a godly man because after Job spoke, after his friends spoke many words, at the end, when God appeared, Job was rebuked. The three friends were also rebuked. Now, you remember when Job spoke, he said, I've not committed any of these sins to deserve this kind of suffering, so it must be God's fault. His friends, of course, had said, Job, you must have done something to deserve all of these sufferings, so it must be your fault. So each of them had said things that were wrong. And in response to the words of his three friends and Job, Elihu rebuked them. And at the end, when God appeared, when he rebuked both Job and the three friends, very significant is that God did not rebuke Elihu. So his commendation came by way of silence. His words were godly, they were true words, and he was a godly man. And we don't have to go far to see what godliness is. All of us know what godliness is. The Bible makes it very clear. And so Elihu was a godly man. He spoke wise words. He had a godly legacy, and he had a godly heritage. And in times of controversy, these are people that we need. Godly, wise, holy people whose words are without reproach. But not only was Elihu godly, he was also zealous. And that's the second point. In times of controversy, we need a voice that is zealous for God, not zealous for self. Now, Elihu was zealous for God's glory, and it showed. Now, when the three friends, when each time they spoke to Job and when Job responded, they were angry. Because Job despaired, his friends despised him, and you could see it in their words. You could hear it in their words. Elihu was also angry, but for God's glory. We're told 4 times by Elihu himself that he was angry. In verse 2, the first part, it says, then was kindled the wrath of Elihu. Now, verse 2, the second part, it says, against Job was his wrath kindled. Verse 3, also against his three friends was his wrath kindled. And in verse 5, then his wrath was kindled. So in other words, here we see that he was angry. Now, anger is not wrong. We're told in the Bible that God is an angry God. But his anger is patient, and his anger is a righteous anger. It is composed. It is not explosive. And the fact that Elihu waited 30 chapters before responding, listening to his friends, listening to Job with that patience, with that control, showed that his anger was a controlled anger. Now, Job's friends were angry with him when they heard him complain. Job was angry with his three friends when they falsely accused him. Now, each believed that they were responding with godly anger, but they were all rebuked by God. Elihu was not. So you could say that his anger here was truly a righteous anger because he saw things the way God saw them as well. The Bible tells us, be angry and sin not. So anger is not always wrong, but with Job and the three friends, there was sinful anger. This was something that his friends were guilty of. In verse 3, it says that they condemned Job. They were so angry that they condemned him. So this anger was an unrighteous anger. As I said, also Elihu was patient. For almost 30 chapters, he heard Job and his three friends speak. And in verses 6 to 7, he said that he waited so long, or he did not speak at first, because he was younger. And he thought that older people would have more wisdom. But finally, he had to speak out of his zeal. Now, why was Elihu angry? There are two reasons. He was angry because of his three friends' foolishness. Verse 1, it says, so these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. They ceased to answer him. You see, before this, they had spoken to convince him, but when he responded, they could not give him an answer. He was right in his eyes. They were right in their eyes. They were both wrong in each other's eyes. And because of that, they could not go further. There was nothing more to say. They had exhausted every avenue. And in the end, they gave up. You see, Job asked these important questions. They tried to answer him, but their wisdom was not sufficient. But each of them thought they were an expert. Job, you be quiet, they said. We will tell you what your problem is. But in the end, in verse 3 here, we're told that they kept silent because they could find no answer. They could find no solution to Job's problems. They were not experts as they claimed to be. And Elihu was angry that they were so foolish. In verses 11 to 12, he says effectively, I waited for your words. I heard your reasons while you tried to explain yourselves. I waited for you, but none of you could convince Job or answer his words. So he was angry because they were foolish. But he was also angry, and he was angry with Job because Job was self-righteous. Verse 2. Against Job was his wrath kindled because he justified himself rather than God. Now, there's nothing wrong with making a defense. The Bible teaches us that there are times when it is absolutely right to defend yourself. This is what Paul did. This is what Jesus also did. But Job was wrong because he was not interested in defending God. He was only interested in defending himself. Now, it says in verse 2 that he justified himself rather than God. And the Bible speaks about three ways that we can justify ourselves. Firstly, it speaks about the inner status. We are justified. A person is justified, a person is righteous because he really is innocent. He hasn't broken any laws. But secondly, the word justify has to do with a legal status. If a person is declared righteous or declared just by a judge, then he is innocent in the eyes of the law. So it's an outward declaration. And thirdly, this word justify has to do with defense. If a person has been falsely accused, he tries to prove and justify his innocence. And this is what Job has done. He's done all three. He believed that he was innocent, righteous inwardly, and he declared himself to be righteous, and he wanted God to declare that he was also innocent, and he tried to prove himself innocent. Now, there's nothing wrong in doing these three things, but Elihu's point is very simple. Elihu was angry because in all of Job's claiming he was innocent, he was more interested in justifying himself than vindicating God. In fact, he never wanted to vindicate God. He blamed God. You see, while his friends were saying, it can't be God's fault, so you must be wrong, it's your fault, Job was frequently saying, it can't be my fault, so it must be God's fault. But what Elihu was saying to Job was, it's not your fault, it's not God's fault either, you just don't know what's happening. And, we are sometimes very black and white. If something goes wrong, someone has to blame, right? If you're in the military, something goes wrong, you have to blame someone. In all of these controversies, it can't just be, now, in saying this, I'm not taking any sides, I'm just, seeing the situation, perhaps this is what it is. The virus could have come from nature, but there has to be some blame, right? So this side is blaming that side, and that side's blaming this side. We all want to attribute blame, but Elihu was saying to Job, yes, it may not be your fault, but it's not God's fault. Why are you blaming God? So, in controversy, we can become angry for ourselves. For ourselves. Other times we're angry with others. But in controversy, the much needed voice is the voice that is zealous for the glory of God. Angry for the things of God. But lastly, in controversy, the voice that is needed is not just a godly, not just a zealous voice, but a wise voice. And Elihu was such a person. He didn't jump to conclusions. He was spiritually minded. In verses 4 to 6, we see here, in his words effectively, he said that, look, I was the youngest, I waited for the rest of you to speak before I spoke. I expected that you, being older men, to provide an answer, but you guys didn't. And only when, Job stopped speaking and when the three friends stopped giving Job an answer, that's when Elihu started to speak. He waited 30 chapters. He heard all of their arguments, all of their observations, all of their logic. Very often when there's gossip, Depends on which gossip you hear, whose side you hear. And it's very sad, isn't it, when people only hear one side, right? They put all their trust in the words of one man or, on this party, not on the other. And you see this in bipartisan politics very often. In the U.S., you've got the Democrats, you've got the Republicans, and people are polarized, but they only hear from one side and not from the other. But here, Elihu heard all their arguments, all their observations, their logic, and he realized that true wisdom was not from outward observation. Because man looks on the outside. That's why we often get things wrong. God looks at the heart. He sees that which is often hidden. Unless we delve into the matter, we can't understand. And Elihu here realized that true wisdom came from God alone. Verse 8, but there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. There is a spirit of man, his own wisdom, and then there is the inspiration of the Almighty. There's man's wisdom, there's God's wisdom. There's such a thing as empirical knowledge. There's science. It's based on observation, repetition, proof, and that's all good in the world for scientists, for engineers, etc. But unless there is a spiritual input and spiritual wisdom, observations may not arrive at the right conclusions. This is the case with Darwinism. Charles Darwin, he observed, he took notes, he researched, and the conclusion that he came up with is that life has evolved. He did not accept by faith that God created. So true wisdom is spiritual. And spiritual things, as Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, cannot be understood by natural man. It has to be spiritually discerned. One must have the Spirit to understand. And the same way, James says, if a man lacks wisdom, let him do what? Apply his brain and observe? No. He tells us to ask of God. And in James, this wisdom of God is described, isn't it? It is first pure. It is peaceable. It is gentle. It is easily entreated. It is full of mercy. So that's the difference. You have the three friends, Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz. In their wisdom, it caused them to denounce Job. Elihu, he was angry, yes, but he was patient. He was peaceable. And when it was time for him to speak, he spoke forcefully, but he spoke peaceably. Job's friends, they were older, they were worldly wise, they were experienced, but they judged Job based on their observation. They were neither gentle, neither peaceable, neither pure. For all of their age, for all of their experience, they were, pardon this expression, they were grumpy old men who got things wrong. Verse 9, Elihu says it in a not so subtle way. He says, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. What they needed was not their worldly wisdom, their observation, but they needed the inspiration of the Almighty. They needed His Word, they needed His wisdom. Without these things, we would be exactly like Job's friends. But Elihu, not only was he spiritually minded, but he was, as you could say, spiritually sided. Now, Job and his friends, they provoked one another. They spoke, he got angry, he spoke, they got angry. But Elihu was different. None of their words were directed at him. You know, when Job's friends spoke, they were directing it at Job. When Job spoke, he was directing it at them. You know, in verse 14, he says that he was out of it. Not out of it, but he was out of this controversy. He was not involved in it. He says, now he hath not directed his words against me, neither will I answer him with your speeches. So Elihu was not emotionally involved. He had no personal vendetta against Job. And that's why he could speak as objectively as he could. He could speak objective truth because he stood outside of their conflict. You know, sometimes in controversy, people offend you, and you get annoyed, you become defensive or offensive, and that is not helpful, and you offend them. You know, very often you may argue out of vengeance, like Job and his friends, rather than to argue, to debate out of a compulsion to seek the truth. So Elihu had no emotional baggage. Very often we need third parties. We need people like that. He told them in verse 14 that, you know, he will not use the arguments of Job or his friends. He will not use their logic or observation or their words. He's not going to repeat their folly. Elihu, rather, is compelled to speak the truth. And he has much to say that was wise. According to verse 18, he said that his words will be full of the Spirit, that his words will be full with new and unvented wine, bursting out of new wineskins. That's a description that you see there in verse 18. It would be fresh, it would be truth. So what Elihu was saying was this: I have something to say, something that all of you have failed to say. It's a gospel perspective to all of this controversy. Verses 21 to 22, it tells us that he will be impartial. He's on no one's side. He's on God's side. And if he were impartial, he says in verse 22, may God, my Maker, quickly remove me. So he was committed to being impartial. Now, so far, we have not heard what Elihu would say. But what is amazing is that in this whole controversy, Job and his three friends did not turn to Elihu and ask him what he thought. So Elihu was sitting there, the three friends were there, Job was there. He argued this way, they argued this way, but none of them turned to Elihu to ask him what he thought. He was sitting there, he was just listening. He was the relative of Abraham, the silent participant. And very often, when we have our own controversies, unfortunately, we do not ask what God thinks. We do not ask the one that we need to hear from. We do not ask for his perspective. We do not search his word. We observe, we listen to each other, different people, and we come to our own conclusion, but we never ask for wisdom from above, which is peaceful, pure, gentle. So as we look at Elihu, at his godliness, at his zeal, and of course, at his wisdom, and we will look further next week, or the next time we study Job, what his words were. But as we look at him, at his godliness, at his zeal, at his wisdom, who does he remind us of? Who was not condemned for his words? Matthew 17, verse 5. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him. You know, on top of that Mount of Transfiguration, with Elijah and Moses there, and Peter and John and James, they wanted to preserve that moment because they thought how wonderful our master is counted to be one of the prophets. But God himself said, no, the other prophets are nothing. This is my son. Listen to him. Yes, the prophets are good, but this is my son. Listen to him. Now, who spoke the truth? Because he was the truth. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, the life. Who was filled with the Spirit? Isaiah 42 verse 1, behold my servant, whom I uphold, my elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my Spirit in him. Jesus was filled with the Spirit, and he was filled with truth. Like new wine. He was filled with the Spirit. He said in Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel, to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives. And who was the one who amazed the older teachers of the law? Who was the one at childhood amazed the doctors? Who was the one who spoke and the religious leaders could not answer? Who taught with such authority that the people were amazed? To all of these questions, it is Christ. In times of controversy, we listen to this voice, to that voice. When it's bipartisan, couples argue, people argue. We take one side or we take the other side. But we do not listen to the voice of Christ. We do not seek. And who is Christ? My God is he. And so it's a reminder to us. Job and his friends, they spoke. They spoke for 30 chapters. If only they had asked Elihu early on, they would have saved their breath. They would have saved their saliva. They would have saved their arguments. If only they looked to Christ. Very often when there is controversy, instead of looking to Christ, we dig our heels into our positions. When what we need, very much so in times of controversy is that other voice. So whatever we will face this year, now, with the lifting of the restrictions, with, the future recession, we will hear many Jobs. We will hear many voices that sound like the three friends. But what we need is Elihu. My God is he who is Christ himself. We need Christ speaking to us. Amen.